2024 was a terrible year for the United Nations, which enters its 80th year of existence, more disrupted than ever. It is becoming increasingly difficult to fulfill the mission for which it was created in San Francisco at the end of the Second World War. In 1945, when 50 countries performed the miracle of signing the UN Charter, half of the world emerging victorious from the catastrophic conflict was still betting on a multilateral institution after the failure of the League of Nations following the First World War. 3 goals were set, the so-called pillars on which the entire UN rests: ensuring peace and security, fostering development, and protecting human rights. With ups and downs, the United Nations managed to navigate the second half of the 20th century, keeping the 3 pillars that support its structure intact so far. Certainly, wars have occurred over the years, such in Korea, fought under the UN flag, whether approved by the Security Council or continued despite its resolutions. But the UN created in San Francisco was born with the main objective of avoiding the war, that is, a third world conflict that will disintegrate human civilization on the planet. For 80 years, it is largely thanks to the UN that the nuclear powers have been restrained from the temptation to use their weapons in development as in defense of rights, albeit with uncertain pace of a pachyderm that may move slowly but steadily. The UN has driven humanity's progress everywhere. Just look at the data on infant mortality or the death penalty from 1945 to today to measure the incredible acceleration the humanitarian aid and the resolutions of the UN headquarters have had on the fate of humanity. In the past, the UN has also faced slowdowns and setbacks, each time determined by the abstractions attitude of the P5, the founding and permanent members of the Security Council, because they were victors of this last world conflict. These are the USA, Russia, former USSR, the UK, France, and China. For almost 30 years, the seat belonged to little Taiwan, as long as the USA wished it so. Which are that the UN has more equal member states, but it is precisely this privilege of nullifying any majority consensus that has maintained the world balance, avoiding the final confrontation. Can it last as it is structured? This is the dilemma that haunts all as the UN turns 80. Through ups and downs, this multilateralist approach to global problems, mirrored in the UN, has guided small and large nations to find the agreed-upon solutions. But since the beginning of the 21st century, the UN, though more indispensable than ever, has gradually been sidelined in solutions. The responsibility always lies with the major shareholders and founders of the enterprise. The United States and Russia, with China so far more interested in staying UN-oriented, first with Bush W and vengeful adventure in Iraq, with NATO's unauthorized attack on Serbia 5 years earlier, signaling a warning, and then with Putin's imperialist ambitions in Ukraine, which began not with the February 2022 invasion, but as early as 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. The miraculous Charter of San Francisco had been turned into a rag to erase international law. Even Joe Biden's administration, which had presented itself to the UN General Assembly after Trump's dark years, proclaiming America is back through its ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, humiliated the Charter when the destruction inflicted by Israel on Palestinian civilians in Gaza went well beyond any justification for retaliation after Hamas' horrific terrorist attack on October 7. The US continued to veto a Security Council resolution for a ceasefire. When they abstained, they argued that the resolution, even approved by all the UK, was not binding because it was not falling under Chapter 7. The return of Donald Trump's administrations will intensify what has always been a US prerogative at the UN, putting national interests above the multilateral health of the UN institution. With Trump, who will send a combative MAGA representative from New York, Elise Stefanik, to the UN, this attitude will be accentuated, though at least less hypocritical. Trump, as he repeatedly stated during his presidency in General Assembly speeches, proclaims his America first without remorse. Thus, it will at least spare us the selective choices seen in Biden's 4 years pretending to condemn Putin's Russia without providing a consistent and credible defense of the Charter's principle. The US will continue with Trumpian enthusiasm to compete with Putin's Russia, leaving China, despite its continued human rights violations, the role of guardian of international law. As far for France and the UK, they have long been aware that they no longer carry the geopolitical weight the veto confers. In fact, neither has used it since 1989. Should we be prepared for the worst? For those who believe that the UN was created to make all 193 member states equal under international law, its failure will already have occurred at its inceptions. For those who still hope that despite the shocks caused by the privileges of the more equal, the UN can continue to serve as both a forum for conflict resolutions and a privileged space for finding possible solutions to keep the experiment of human civilization alive, as summarized in the 17 UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, reaffirmed in the Pact for the Future, approved in September, it becomes a duty to hope that the UN can make it. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in his New Year message, referred to 2025 as a new beginning. Referring to the 10 hottest years ever recorded on the planet, Guterres spoke of climate collapse in real time. We must get off this path of ruin, and we have no time to lose. However, Guterres, in the midst of his second term, has several serious mistakes to atone for that have not helped the UN's credibility, such as bowing to Putin wanted by the International Criminal Court. But the success or failure of the Secretary General, despite being the organization's most visible figure, has never determined the future of the United Nations. When a UNSG were ousted literally, as in the case of Dag Hammarskjöld, or simply dismissed, as in Boutros Boutros-Ghali's case, the UN found new leaders to resume its mission. Javier Pérez Cuellar and Kofi Annan among the most effective. Will it fall for the first time to a woman to revive the UN's multilateralist mission? Perhaps 2 years from now, such a novelty might help draw more public attention to UN affairs, but it will not suffice for the institution's revival. In 2025, the UN will have to, despite Trump's returning heading to Putin's bullying, garner enough multilateral consensus under its current leadership to channel sufficient resources to alleviate human suffering in Gaza as in Ukraine. Sudan as in Haiti, Afghanistan as in Myanmar, and wherever human rights continue to be trampled. Guterres stated that even in the darkest day, he has seen a change in the power of hope, paying tribute to activists of all ages, humanitarian heroes overcoming enormous obstacles to support the most vulnerable. Declaring that there are no guarantees for what awaits us in 2025, Guterres concluded by saying, "Together we can make 2025 a new beginning, not as a divided world, but as united nations." Can hope in the UN's capabilities be realistic? Richard Falk and Hans von Sponeck, in their latest book titled Liberating the United Nations, Realism with Hope, while analyzing all the shortcomings of the 80 years old institution, still believe in it. Both the Princeton professor of international law and the former German diplomat have had significant experiences serving the UN, giving their study a valid historical reconstruction, and above all, providing an authoritative proposal for achieving the necessary reform. As long as the nations remain the instrument for guiding humanity's progress or regression, the hope of containing the dangers lies in the organization invented in San Francisco 80 years ago. Wishing the UN well for the new year means wishing for all those who support peace against war, the right to health against diseases and epidemics, development against poverty and famine, and above all, that justice prevails against oppression. Best wishes to the UN for survival in 2025, not out of hope, but out of realism.